Soldiers who once defended the empire with bravery, now cast aside, wounded and forgotten. What happens when these men, once heroes, are left with no choice? Many of them found a new chance at survival, but not in the ranks of Rome. Instead, in the arena as gladiators. Most people associate gladiators with slaves and criminals, condemned to fight to the death. But what few know is that some of the fiercest gladiators were once elite soldiers, warriors who, after being maimed in battle, were abandoned by the very system they were sworn to protect. They had no other path except to fight again, this time, not for Rome, but for their own survival. Ask yourself, what drives a war veteran to submit to the dangers of the arena, where death is a spectacle and life depends on skill with a sword? These men, who once faced enemies on the empire's frontiers, now face their fellow fighters in the arena, battling not just for honor, but for their very existence. In this story of sacrifice and desperation, we'll uncover how the ranks of the gladiators swelled with wounded soldiers, forgotten by Rome, but transformed into legends of the arena. The truth behind these violent, desperate transitions is more complex and tragic than you might imagine. Stay with us as we explore the dark reality of these warriors who fought at any cost to survive. The battlefields of the Roman Empire were vast and unforgiving, leaving behind a trail of wounded soldiers, many of whom were no longer fit for service. These men, once celebrated for their bravery and dedication, found themselves discarded, with no support from the state they had defended. The transition from a soldier to a gladiator was not a choice of ambition, but one of survival. For many veterans, the promise of a home, land, or pension vanished with their injuries, leaving them adrift in a society that valued only strength and service. Injured soldiers, often missing limbs or suffering from debilitating wounds, were no longer useful to the military machine of Rome. The empire had no formal rehabilitation system, no safety net for its wounded heroes. Without the ability to earn a living or return to their previous roles, they became outcasts. Some turned to begging, while others were forced into manual labor. But for those with combat skills still intact, the arena offered a dark glimmer of hope. Here, they could use what they knew best, fighting. The world of gladiatorial combat was ruthless, but it provided a chance for these men to reclaim a sense of purpose. Though the arena was filled with slaves and criminals, soldiers turned gladiators brought with them the training, discipline, and ferocity learned on the battlefield. Their injuries, while severe, were often compensated by their experience in war, which gave them an edge over other fighters. This advantage, however, came at a cost. The arena demanded not only physical prowess, but also the willingness to fight to the death for the amusement of the crowd. As soldiers, these men fought for the empire, often believing in a cause greater than themselves. As gladiators, the motivations changed. They no longer fought for Rome, but for their own survival and, in some cases, the slim hope of freedom. The transition from soldier to gladiator was a painful one, marked by a deep sense of betrayal. Rome had turned its back on them, but the arena, in its brutal way, offered them a lifeline, a chance to survive in a world that had discarded them. The irony was not lost on these men. Once protectors of the empire, they now found themselves in a spectacle for its entertainment. The arena became both their prison and their battlefield. Though stripped of their former identities as soldiers, in the eyes of the spectators, they were reborn as gladiators, fighting not for glory or honor, but for the basic right to live another day. Rome's reputation as a powerful empire was built on the backs of its soldiers. Yet the empire showed little regard for those who were no longer able to fight. Injured veterans were often left without the resources to survive, much less thrive. Promises of land or pensions made to soldiers frequently went unfulfilled, especially if they returned from war unable to perform physical labor. The bitter reality of abandonment sank in, as men who once marched proudly for the empire now found themselves begging in the streets or struggling to find a way to live. The betrayal these soldiers felt was profound. For many, the transition from battlefield hero to societal outcast was swift and merciless. Their injuries were badges of honor, But instead of receiving recognition, they were viewed as burdens. Rome had no place for broken soldiers. The social contract between the state and its defenders had been severed, leaving a vacuum in the lives of those who had sacrificed so much. This vacuum was filled with desperation, and for many, that desperation led them to the one place where they could still be valued for their combat skills, the gladiatorial arena. In the eyes of the Roman elite, these wounded warriors had outlived their usefulness. They were seen as damaged goods, no longer capable of contributing to the military or the economy. However, in a violent world of gladiatorial combat, these same men found a twisted form of value. The public craved blood and spectacle, and who better to provide it than men who had already faced death on the battlefield? This cruel irony was not lost on the soldiers turned gladiators. They had fought for the empire, only to be cast aside and forced to fight for survival in front of cheering crowds. The psychological toll of this betrayal was immense. Soldiers who had once been part of a brotherhood, bound by loyalty to Rome and each other, now stood alone in the arena, fighting for their lives. The sense of abandonment ran deep, and for many, it was the driving force behind their brutal performances in the arena. They were no longer fighting for the empire, but against it, against a system that had discarded them without a second thought. Every swing of the sword, every dodge, was a rebellion against the state that had left them to die. Yet, despite the bitterness and betrayal, the arena gave these men a perverse sense of purpose. In the blood-soaked sand, they could reclaim some measure of control over their fates. The life of a gladiator was short and brutal, but it was a life on their terms, a defiant stand in the face of Rome's indifference. The betrayal they experienced fueled their desire to survive, and in surviving, they became legends in their own right, symbols of Rome's failure to care for its own. For wounded soldiers, the transition into the life of a gladiator was not one of glory, but of grim necessity. The arena called to them, not with the promise of riches or fame, but with the chance to reclaim control over their lives, however fleeting it might be. Many entered this world with little hope of survival, but their instincts as warriors, honed on the battlefield, gave them an edge. They had already faced death many times, and for some, the idea of dying in combat, even in front of a bloodthirsty crowd, was preferable to wasting away in obscurity. Once inside the arena, these former soldiers found themselves surrounded by men who had never known the discipline of a legion. Slaves, criminals, and other societal outcasts filled the ranks of the gladiators, but the veterans stood apart. Their training was superior, their strategies more calculated, and their endurance unmatched. They brought with them the tactics of war, turning their matches into more than just spectacles of brute force. The arena, for all its chaos, was still a place where skill could mean the difference between life and death, and these soldiers turned gladiators knew how to seize any advantage they could find. However, the arena demanded more than just technical prowess. It demanded showmanship. The soldiers who had once fought in disciplined formations now had to learn the art of performance. The crowd did not want to see calculated victories. They wanted blood, emotion, and drama. For many veterans, this was the hardest part of the transition. In battle, restraint and precision were virtues. In the arena, they had to put on a show, exaggerating their movements, taunting their opponents, and playing to the whims of the audience. The shift was jarring, but those who adapted quickly became the most popular and feared fighters in the arena. The identity of these men transformed along with their fighting style. No longer were they soldiers fighting for Rome. They were now entertainers, gladiators, fighting for survival and the fleeting admiration of the crowd. The battlefield had been a place of camaraderie and mutual dependence, where the lives of others often depended on your actions. In the arena, however, it was every man for himself. The loneliness of the gladiators' existence weighed heavily on these veterans, who had been trained to think in terms of unit cohesion and collective victory. Now, their success hinged on their individual ability to survive fight after fight. The path from soldier to gladiator was one of loss of comrades, loss of identity, and loss of the purpose they once had as defenders of the empire. Yet, in this new life, they found a strange sense of rebirth. In the bloodied sand of the arena, they could reinvent themselves, not as forgotten veterans, but as legends. The world of the gladiator offered them something that Rome had not, a chance to be remembered, even if it was through violence and spectacle. The life of a gladiator was a constant struggle for survival, a brutal existence that mirrored the intensity of the battlefields these veterans had once known. The arena was a place where every fight could be your last, and each combatant entered the ring knowing that a single mistake could mean death. The blood-soaked sand under their feet became as familiar as the mud of the front lines, and the roar of the crowd replaced the battle cries of their comrades. In many ways, the arena was war, distilled into its most savage form, with no greater cause to fight for but one's own survival. Training for the arena was grueling and relentless. While veterans already possessed the skills necessary for combat, they had to adapt to a new kind of warfare, one focused on entertainment as much as on effectiveness. Gladiators were trained to use a variety of weapons, from swords and tridents to nets and shields. They had to learn how to engage in both close-quarters combat and showy maneuvers that would captivate the audience. Every match was a performance, a delicate balance between life-threatening combat and theatrical spectacle. Those who mastered both had the best chance of surviving and thriving in this deadly sport. For the veterans, the arena was a place of constant tension. Unlike the battlefield, where strategies were often pre-planned and objectives clear, the arena was unpredictable. They faced opponents of all kinds, trained fighters, wild animals, and even entire groups of enemies in stage battles. Each encounter required them to think quickly and act decisively, often in front of tens of thousands of spectators who demanded nothing less than a thrilling, bloody show. The stakes were always high, and the pressure to deliver a memorable performance could be as lethal as the weapons they wielded. Despite the dangers, some veterans managed to find success in the arena, earning fame and fortune as crowd favorites. Their skills, honed from years of military training, often made them formidable opponents, and their stories of survival in both war and the arena only added to their mystique. However, this success came at a cost. The physical toll of constant fighting left many gladiators with chronic injuries, and the mental strain of living under the threat of death weighed heavily on their minds. In the end, no matter how skilled or popular a gladiator became, they were all bound by the same fate: eventual death, either in the arena or outside of it. The arena was a place where men were reduced to their most primal instincts. In the eyes of the crowd, these veterans were no longer soldiers or even men. They were spectacles, objects of fascination and fear. Each fight was a reminder of their mortality, and each victory only postponed the inevitable. Yet, for many of these former soldiers, the arena was all they had left. It gave them a purpose, a way to keep fighting, even when the rest of the world had cast them aside. And in that fight, they found a strange, fleeting sense of freedom,